Miami used to be paradise, where dreams were born under endless sun and where anyone could reinvent themselves beneath swaying palm trees. But something happened that nobody wants to talk about, something that transformed the Magic City into a place where locals can no longer afford to exist, where the soul of an entire community was sold to the highest bidder, and where the American dream became a luxury item priced beyond recognition. What really happened to Miami? The truth is darker than you think, and once you see it, you will never look at this city the same way again. Once upon a time, Miami was the city of possibility. In the 1980s and 90s, families could buy homes on modest incomes, artists could afford studio spaces in South Beach, and young professionals could build lives without crushing debt hanging over their heads. The beaches were not just for tourists, but belonged to everyone who called this place home. Neighborhoods like Little Havana, Coconut Grove, and Winewood thrived with authentic culture, local businesses passed down through generations, and communities that knew each other by name. There was magic in the air, a sense that Miami was yours if you worked hard enough, if you believed enough. Cuban immigrants built empires from nothing. Haitian communities created vibrant cultural centers, and artists transformed abandoned warehouses into galleries that attracted the world. This was not just a city, it was a promise kept. But around the turn of the millennium, something began to shift. Foreign investors started arriving in waves, cash in hand, hungry for real estate in a city that never stopped shining. At first, it seemed like progress, like validation that Miami had finally arrived on the world stage. Luxury condominiums began sprouting along Biscayne Boulevard, each one taller and more exclusive than the last. Developers promised that this new money would lift all boats, that prosperity would trickle down to everyone. They said Miami was becoming a global city, and global cities need global investment. What they did not say was who would pay the price. What they did not mention was that this transformation would require a sacrifice, and that sacrifice would be the people who built Miami with their bare hands. The first warning signs appeared in the early 2000s, when rental prices began climbing faster than wages. A two-bedroom apartment that cost $900 a month in 2000 suddenly cost $1,500 by 2005, then $2,000 by 2010. Families who had lived in Miami Beach for generations found themselves priced out, forced to move inland, then further inland, then out of the county entirely. But the media called it progress. Financial analysts celebrated Miami's rising property values as proof of success. Nobody asked where the teachers were supposed to live, where the nurses would go, where the restaurant workers who served those expensive meals would sleep at night. We have all seen this story before in other cities, but somehow we thought Miami would be different. Somehow we believed the sun would protect us from the cold mathematics of greed. By 2015, Miami had become the most unaffordable city in America relative to median income, surpassing even New York and San Francisco in the gap between what people earned and what it cost to live. The median home price climbed above $400,000, while the median household income hovered around $40,000. Simple math revealed an impossible equation, but the construction never stopped. Developers were not building for locals anymore. They were building for investors in Argentina, Brazil, Russia, and Venezuela who needed to park their money somewhere safe, somewhere sunny, somewhere that asked no questions. These luxury towers rose into the Miami sky like glass tombstones, monuments to wealth that would never be lived in, never be loved, never become homes. They stood empty, dark at night, investments on spreadsheets in faraway cities. Meanwhile, third-generation Miami families packed their belongings and moved to cheaper states, carrying with them the death of the dream that brought their grandparents here. The cultural soul of Miami began to die in plain sight, but it happened so gradually that many did not notice until it was too late. Wynwood, once a Puerto Rican neighborhood and later an artist haven where creativity flourished in abandoned warehouses, became a playground for Instagram influencers and bottomless brunch tourists. Rents in Winewood exploded from $500 for a warehouse studio to $5,000 for the same space within a decade. The artists who painted those famous murals that made Wynwood cool could no longer afford to live there. They were evicted by the very success they created, pushed out by landlords who realized they could charge Manhattan prices for Miami zip codes. The irony was vicious, a snake eating its own tail. The people who gave a neighborhood its character were systematically removed so that others could consume that character like a product, take selfies in front of colorful walls, and then leave without ever understanding what was lost. Little Havana faced a similar fate. This neighborhood, the beating heart of Cuban exile culture, where domino games filled the parks and where the scent of Café Cubano mixed with cigar smoke, and where Spanish was not just spoken but lived, became a target for redevelopment. Old family restaurants that had served the same recipes for 50 years suddenly could not afford the rent when their leases came up for renewal. Buildings that housed community centers and cultural organizations were sold to developers who saw only square footage and profit margins. The new Little Havana, marketed to tourists, featured sanitized versions of Cuban culture, theme park experiences, designed by people who had never fled a revolution, never left everything behind for freedom, never knew what it meant to preserve culture as an act of survival. We have all watched neighborhoods lose their souls, but when it happens slowly, when it happens behind the facade of progress, we tell ourselves it is inevitable. We tell ourselves that that is just how cities evolve. But evolution and extinction are different things, and what happened to Miami's cultural neighborhoods was not evolution. Then came the pandemic in 2020, and the transformation accelerated beyond anyone's darkest predictions. Remote workers from tech companies in California and finance firms in New York discovered they could keep their six-figure salaries while escaping state income taxes and winter weather. They flooded into Miami by the thousands, armed with buying power that made locals look like peasants at an auction. A modest house in Liberty City that a teacher might have saved years to afford suddenly received all-cash offers 30% above asking price from someone who had never set foot in Miami. Landlords began evicting long-term tenants not because they failed to pay rent, but because they could get double or triple the amount from newcomers who did not flinch at prices that would have been obscene just months earlier. This was not a market correction or a temporary boom. This was a hostile takeover disguised as migration. But the newcomers brought something else with them beyond money. They brought an expectation that Miami should serve them, that it should transform itself into their vision of what a city should be. They complained about salsa music being too loud, about domino games in the parks, about the chaos and color and life that made Miami what it was. They demanded more upscale brunch spots, more craft cocktail bars, more spaces that felt like the places they left behind. And developers, always eager to please those with money, obliged. One by one, the authentic gave way to the artificial. The local became the branded. The community became the commodity. This has happened before in cities across America, but Miami was supposed to be different because Miami was built by immigrants and exiles who knew what it meant to lose everything. Somehow, that history was forgotten in the rush for foreign capital and luxury tax revenue. By 2023, the median rent in Miami had reached over $3,000 per month, an increase of over 40% in just 3 years. The median household could no longer afford the median apartment. Essential workers, the people who kept the city functioning, faced an impossible choice. Spend 70 or 80% of their income on housing, live with multiple roommates and overcrowded conditions, or leave. Teachers left, nurses left, paramedics left. The people who serve your food, who clean hotel rooms, who keep hospitals running, who teach your children, they either left or they suffered in silence, commuting 2 hours each way from counties you have never heard of, sleeping in cars between shifts, sacrificing everything for the privilege of working in a city they could no longer afford to enjoy. But this story was not on the news, because the news was busy celebrating Miami's transformation into a global city, a tech hub, a crypto capital. Nobody wanted to ask what it meant to be a global city with no locals left. The promise of economic development was always that new investment would create opportunities for everyone, that luxury condos would somehow generate affordable housing, that rising tides would lift all boats. But that promise was a lie. And we all knew it was a lie, even if we did not want to admit it. Luxury development does not create affordable housing. any more than building Ferraris creates affordable transportation. What it creates is displacement, cultural erasure, and a city that serves only those who need it least. Miami's government could have intervened. They could have implemented rent control, could have required developers to include affordable units, could have protected long-term residents from eviction without cause, could have taxed empty investment properties to discourage speculation. But they did not, because the money was too good, because campaign donations flowed from development firms, because elected officials convinced themselves that what was good for real estate values was good for Miami. The environmental crisis added another layer to Miami's collapse that most people have not connected yet. Miami sits barely above sea level, built on porous limestone that allows seawater to seep upward through the ground itself. Climate scientists have been screaming warnings for decades that Miami faces an existential threat from rising seas, from increasingly powerful hurricanes, from king tides that flood streets on sunny days. But instead of planning for managed retreat, instead of investing in adaptation and resilience for existing communities, Miami doubled down on luxury development in the most vulnerable areas. Billionaire Row on Miami Beach, where condos sell for tens of millions of dollars, floods regularly now. The response from developers? Build higher, build seawalls, install massive pumps to fight back the ocean. This engineering arrogance assumes that enough money can solve physics, that wealth can purchase exemption from the laws of nature. Meanwhile, working-class neighborhoods in low-lying areas receive no such protection. They flood, they mold, they become unlivable, and their residents are left to fend for themselves because infrastructure investment follows money, not need. But wait until you see what they did next, because the collapse of Miami as a livable city for working people came with a twist that reveals just how deep the rot goes. As rents and home prices spiraled beyond reach, as locals were pushed further and further from the urban core, Miami's government and business leaders began marketing the city as a haven for cryptocurrency investors and tech entrepreneurs seeking to escape regulation and taxation. They welcomed those who made fortunes in digital speculation, rolled out red carpets for companies fleeing oversight, and positioned Miami as a place where money could flow freely without inconvenient questions about origins or ethics. The mayor appeared at Bitcoin conferences promising that Miami would become the crypto capital of the world. Venture capitalists flooded in, hosted parties on yachts, bought penthouses sight unseen, and drove prices even higher for everyone else. This was not accidental. This was a deliberate strategy that sacrificed the well-being of existing residents for the possibility of attracting mobile global capital. The message was clear. Miami does not belong to the people who live here. It belongs to whoever can pay the most. This is late-stage capitalism in its purest form, where cities compete to attract the wealthy by offering them everything while asking nothing in return, where local communities are expendable in the race to become someone's tax shelter. You have felt this too, if you have watched your hometown change beyond recognition, if you have been priced out of neighborhoods where you grew up, if you have seen local businesses replaced by chains and luxury brands that sell everything except what made the place special to begin with. The psychological toll of watching your city die in front of you while everyone celebrates its success cannot be overstated. There is a special kind of gaslighting that happens when you struggle to afford rent in the place you were born while articles praise your city's booming economy. There is rage that builds when you see empty luxury towers casting shadows over communities that can barely keep the lights on. There is grief that comes from knowing your children will never experience the Miami you knew, that they will grow up in a place that tolerates their existence only if they serve the wealthy, that the stories of their grandparents building something beautiful here will become irrelevant nostalgia. This grief is real and it is widespread, but it is not newsworthy because grief does not generate tax revenue. Artists, musicians, and cultural workers were among the first to sound the alarm, but nobody listened because artists are always complaining about rent. They left in waves, taking with them the creative energy that made Miami interesting in the first place. The music venues closed, the galleries shuttered. The underground scenes that gave birth to Miami bass and freestyle, the punk shows in Little Haiti, the poetry slams in Overtown, the jazz clubs in Liberty City, they all faded away because art requires space and time and community, none of which are possible when you work 3 jobs just to afford a room in someone's house an hour from the city center. What remained was a city with money but no soul, with luxury but no culture, with visitors but no community. Miami became a beautiful corpse, perfectly preserved and utterly lifeless. The education system collapsed under the weight of these economic pressures. Teachers fled Miami-Dade County in record numbers, unable to survive on salaries that had not kept pace with the cost of living. Schools in working-class neighborhoods struggled with constant turnover, oversized classes, and crumbling infrastructure, while private schools in wealthy areas thrived. The message to poor children was clear. Your education does not matter. Your future is not a priority. You are acceptable collateral damage in the transformation of Miami into a playground for the global elite. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented fact in budget allocations, in teacher retention rates, in achievement gaps that widened as inequality deepened. We have all seen this pattern play out before, but somehow we keep acting surprised when neglecting the next generation has consequences. Healthcare workers faced similar crises. Nurses and hospital staff could not afford to live near the facilities where they worked, leading to staffing shortages and burnout that endangered patient care. Emergency response times increased as first responders were forced to live further from the communities they served. The infrastructure that keeps a city alive, the invisible network of essential workers who hold everything together, it began to fray. But City Hall was too busy cutting ribbons on new luxury developments to notice or care. The incentives were all wrong. Politicians won elections by promising growth and development, not by protecting vulnerable residents. Developers donated to campaigns and lobbied for favorable zoning changes. The machine fed itself while the city it was supposed to serve withered from within. The homeless population exploded as the affordable housing crisis reached its inevitable conclusion. People who had jobs, who worked full-time, found themselves living in cars or shelters because even a studio apartment cost more than they earned. Families with children couch-surfed with relatives, doubled and tripled up in apartments meant for half as many people, or left Miami entirely despite generations of roots. The visible homelessness that resulted was then used to justify aggressive policing and sweeps that criminalized poverty rather than addressing its causes. Encampments were cleared not because people were housed, but because they were bad for property values, because tourists did not want to see the human cost of the city's economic model. This cruelty was policy, enacted in the name of keeping Miami desirable for those who could afford to enjoy it. Meanwhile, the luxury real estate market showed signs of its own instability. Many of those expensive condos sat empty, owned by shell companies and foreign investors who might visit a few weeks per year at most. This created ghost towers, vertical ghost towns where lights rarely turned on and amenities went unused. The promised economic benefits of all this development failed to materialize for working people. Construction jobs were temporary and often went to workers from other states. Service jobs in luxury buildings paid poverty wages. The wealth did not trickle down because that is not how wealth works. It pooled at the top, concentrated among developers and investors and real estate agents who brokered deals for properties most locals could never dream of affording. The COVID pandemic revealed just how fragile this economy, built on tourism and real estate speculation, really was. When travel stopped, when conventions canceled, when cruise ships sat empty, Miami's economic engine sputtered. The service workers who had been priced out found themselves laid off with no safety net, no savings, no options. The government response was to accelerate the policies that caused the crisis in the first place, to double down on attracting remote workers and investors, to offer even more incentives to developers. They learned nothing from the collapse because learning would require admitting that the emperor had no clothes, that Miami's boom was built on exploitation and unsustainable growth. that you cannot have a functioning city when the people who make it function cannot afford to live there. The insurance crisis compounded everything. As climate risks increased, insurance companies either left the Florida market entirely or raised rates to levels that made homeownership impossible, even for those who could afford mortgages. Property owners faced annual insurance bills in the tens of thousands of dollars. Condo associations passed these costs to residents through skyrocketing fees. The dream of homeownership, already distant for most, became pure fantasy. Even those who had managed to buy before the boom found themselves trapped, unable to sell because buyers could not secure affordable insurance, unable to stay because the costs kept rising. This vicious cycle created a housing market frozen in dysfunction, where nobody could afford to buy and nobody could afford to own. Throughout all of this, Miami's government continued to approve new luxury developments as if nothing was wrong. Zoning changes favored high-end construction over affordable housing. Tax breaks went to developers promising luxury amenities rather than to projects that might house teachers or nurses or firefighters. The planning department seemed to operate in an alternate reality where everyone earned six figures and housing costs were not a crisis. Public hearings became performative exercises where residents pleaded for affordable housing requirements and density limits and protections for existing communities, only to watch the commission approve projects anyway. The fix was in. The game was rigged. The outcome was predetermined. Democracy became theater, while the real decisions were made in private meetings between developers and officials, sealed with campaign contributions and promises of future favors. The cultural erasure that accompanied all this economic transformation was perhaps the most painful loss, because it happened slowly, one business closure at a time, one evicted family at a time, one demolished building at a time. The Afro-Caribbean community in Little Haiti watched their neighborhood targeted for redevelopment with marketing materials that literally sold Little Haiti as a brand, while displacing the Haitian families who created the culture being commodified. This was not accidental violence. This was systematic erasure, cultural genocide by market forces, the elimination of communities that had survived dictatorship and natural disaster and poverty only to be destroyed by prosperity that benefited everyone except them. Their churches became yoga studios. Their restaurants became farm-to-table gastropubs. Their homes became investment properties. And the painful irony, the truly cruel joke, was that this was all called progress. The Latin American communities that built Miami, who made it a bilingual, bicultural city unlike anywhere else in America, found themselves increasingly marginalized in the very place they created. El español de Espoca suddenly considered less desirable than the English of newcomers. Las bodeguitas and fondas que fed workers for decades closed, replaced by artisanal coffee shops where a single drink cost more than an hour's wages. The remittance shops and immigration services that connected families across borders shuttered as rents became untenable. What remained was a sanitized, commodified version of Latin culture, salsa nights for tourists who mispronounced menu items, Spanglish as affectation rather than necessity, culture as costume rather than lived experience. This hollow appropriation added insult to the injury of displacement. But perhaps the greatest betrayal was how many accepted this transformation as inevitable. How many threw up their hands and said, that is just how cities work now, or at least the economy is booming, or if you cannot afford it, move somewhere cheaper. This learned helplessness, this capitulation to market forces as if they were natural laws rather than human choices, it revealed how thoroughly we have internalized the logic of late capitalism. We forgot or never knew that cities are supposed to serve their residents, that housing is a human right, that communities have value beyond their real estate prices, that growth without equity is not progress. The neoliberal revolution convinced us that government intervention in markets was socialism, or worse, that any attempt to protect vulnerable people from displacement was an infringement on property rights. And so we stood by and watched as Miami was hollowed out, telling ourselves there was nothing to be done, that this was simply the way of the world. The comparison to other cities that underwent similar transformations is instructive. San Francisco priced out the artists and activists and working-class families that gave it character, becoming a sterile tech campus with a housing crisis so severe that people earning six figures struggled. New York's Manhattan became a playground for the global wealthy, while the outer boroughs gentrified in waves, pushing communities further and further from opportunity. London, Vancouver, Sydney, Hong Kong, cities around the world followed the same script, allowing housing to become a speculative asset rather than a social good, with predictable and devastating results. Miami was not unique. It was simply following a playbook written by global capital, a playbook that works exactly as intended for those who own property and devastates everyone else. The long-term consequences of what happened to Miami extend far beyond housing costs. When teachers and nurses and firefighters and police officers cannot afford to live in the communities they serve, social cohesion breaks down. When young people grow up knowing they will never afford to live where they were raised, they lose investment in the future of those places. When neighborhoods turn over completely every few years as rents force people to move again and again, no one forms the bonds that make communities resilient. What emerges is a transient population of renters serving a largely absent owner class, a feudal arrangement dressed up in contemporary aesthetics. A city that functions as a machine for extracting wealth rather than a home for human beings. The environmental time bomb ticking beneath all this makes the situation even more absurd. Miami has perhaps 20 to 30 years before sea level rise makes much of the city uninhabitable. Every dollar spent on luxury development in flood zones is money that will be lost. Every family priced out and pushed inland will watch from safety as the coastal properties that displaced them sink beneath the waves. The wealthy investors who own those glass towers will cut their losses and move their capital elsewhere. But what about everyone else? What about the low-income communities and low-lying areas who lack the resources to relocate? What about the infrastructure investments that will be underwater in a generation? Miami is building frantically at the edge of an abyss, and everyone knows it. But the incentive structures reward short-term profit over long-term survival. If there is hope in this story, it comes from the resistance that has begun to form. Tenant unions are organizing across the city, fighting evictions and demanding rent control. Activists are pushing for affordable housing requirements and preservation of cultural neighborhoods. Artists are creating guerrilla cultural spaces in the margins. Young people are running for office on platforms of equity and sustainability rather than development and growth. The fight is not over, but it requires acknowledging how bad things have become, rejecting the narrative that this is inevitable or acceptable, and building power to change the incentive structures that created this crisis. Empty tables line Calle Ocho now, where families used to gather. Empty streets replace the sounds of children playing in neighborhoods where children can no longer afford to live. Empty dreams haunt the people who believed Miami would always have room for them, who thought their labor and their love would be enough to earn a place in the city they built. The silence is deafening in those glass towers that stand dark at night, monuments to wealth that exists only on balance sheets. The soul of Miami is dying, murdered slowly by greed dressed up as progress, strangled by market forces unleashed without conscience or constraint. But maybe there is still time to remember what cities are supposed to be. Maybe there is still a chance to choose community over capital, people over profit, culture over commodification. Maybe Miami can become a cautionary tale that inspires other cities to choose differently, to protect their residents before their real estate values, to prioritize housing as a human right rather than an investment vehicle. Maybe the people who were pushed out can organize and fight back and win enough concessions to make Miami livable again. Maybe the next generation will learn from these mistakes and build something better. Or maybe Miami becomes what it is becoming, a luxury resort that happened to incorporate as a city, a place that exists to serve the wealthy and tolerate everyone else only as far as they are useful, a paradise lost to the very people who loved it most. Maybe this is the future of cities in an age of extreme inequality and global capital mobility. Maybe what happened to Miami is coming for everywhere eventually, unless we wake up and fight like our homes depend on it, because they do. The choice is ours, but the clock is running out. If you have felt this change too, if you have watched your hometown sold out from under you, if you recognize this pattern of greed masked as progress, share your story. The first step in fighting back is refusing to pretend this is normal or acceptable or inevitable. And if you found this revealing, subscribe, because the next story might show where everyone who left Miami is going next, and whether those places will make the same mistakes or choose a different path. The story of cities in the 21st century is being written right now, and we all have a say in how it ends.